we have Mr. Kalani Souza, and he's with the National Disaster Preparedness Center and the Olohana Foundation. And he's going to be talking about the intergenerational transfer, knowledge, place, responsibility, relationship, and community capacity for regenerative sustainability. And so he's going to be live streaming, and we're good to go.
Aloha everyone, I hope you can hear me. I am so glad to be with you today, and it's just a day off of World Water Day, so what a fabulous day to be talking about the environment and our relationship to the earth and the earth mother and the systems that keep us all healthy and alive, and what that means to our learning, both about ourselves and about each other. But one thing I learned from my grandfather was, if it doesn't begin right, then how's it gonna end right? And so that tradition, I think we should begin with a pule, or a prayer, which is nothing more than a centering of one's mind and body and spirit. In Polynesia, they say the body, the mind, and the spirit all have to learn simultaneously. So please indulge me. Iko mako I maku I loko o Kalani. Mahalo pia naku I. Mahalo ke akua. Nao uhane I kawai. Mahalo I tala I nawa hine o ke kai. Mahalo Awatea, e kani I kawai. Mahalo e papohonua. E pai aina e olumai. Mahalo e mahina. Le kuhi mana I ike mai. Mahalo e matina nui. Mai tapo e ike au. Mahalo I a kako. E mana upono e na au. Mahalo he mele nei. Thank you, great Creator who stands behind all things, and to the Spirit in the water. Thank you to the Grandfather Sun, to the woman who is the sea. Thank you to the Sky Father, and to Kalani in the water. And thank you to the Earth Mother in whom we all reside. Thank you to the Grandmother Moon, brings us the time and tides. Thank you to the Great Grandmother, who from the darkness of space will bring us light. And thank you, all of you, for what you think is right and for how you feel. And thank you for the song, thank you for the dance, and thank you for the time to heal. Mahalo ke akua, amuhane I kawai. Thank you, great Creator, who stands behind all things, and to the Spirit in the water. Thank you. And so, what a pleasure this morning to be able to talk to you about the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. I've been working in the field of indigenous traditional practice and modern science and that intersection for some 27 years now. And we've always put a lot of emphasis, or as they say, emphasis, on TEK, on traditional ecological knowledge. My uncle, he would say, oh, they're looking for the new berry. Is that the thing? They're looking for the next big solution. So in this day and age where we're becoming so much smarter around intellectual property rights and free and informed consent, we begin to challenge these notions of research by an academic institution for whose purposes. And so those conversations are happening in the TEK arena. But what I've tried to emphasize is the real treasure is the ITK, the intergenerational transfer of the knowledge. Not so much the data itself, but more how the data is preserved, how those stories are preserved, and how that information is moved along generationally through time. The mechanism of that transfer is actually more important to the community and the preservation of that transfer mechanism than the actual pieces of data themselves, since the data has a tendency to change, to readjust through the scope of time. So, in Polynesian culture, specifically Hawaiian culture, grandparents are referred to as kupuna, or standing at the spring. Grandchildren are referred to as mo'opuna. Mo'o means lizard, or those on all four legs crawling towards the spring. The parents group are called makua, or what belongs to your back, what stands behind you. But you'll notice kupuna, makua, mo'opuna. So in the language itself, it points at the connectivity between the grandparents and the grandchildren, this sort of leapfrogging of generations. That's a control mechanism to ensure that the information is being passed down in a consistent way, because it's being passed from grandparent to grandchild alternatingly. So the parents will become grandparents in their time, and they will be passing the information down to their grandchildren. And now we have a safety, a sort of blind baseline, as it were, because you can compare these generations and see if the learning is consistent, the same, and looking for the same outcomes. So that's one interesting thing revealed within the cultural lens that differs from the modern education system. The other one is sort of obvious. It's this competitive individual achievement sort of philosophy of the culture of modernity, whereas in most indigenous, native, and tribal cultures, you encounter a more communal sense of all things. I like to call it the power of we over me. It's kind of like a mathematical formula. You know, it's the we to the X power over the me. So when we begin to recognize the necessary value and function of the wave versus the particle, we begin to actualize perhaps one of the great cultural rifts between the culture of modernity and traditional indigenous cultures. So that's something that academia is not having an easy time dealing with. You know, there's only one gold star. It goes to the one kid who doesn't have to clean the erasers after class, but does anyway, because, you know, scoring points with authority, something we humans also play at. So that's one way of looking at it. Now let's see how that impacts the learning and the systems adjustment we find directly out in community. Now, as the Olohana Foundation and with the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center, and along with other programs at the University of Hawaii, like Scheidler Business College and the Pacific Business programs, we're working towards some really larger baseline solutions that include waste to fuel management, the creation of compost and industry making machines, coupled with freshwater remuneration, you know, coupled with organic material being recovered and turned into stabilized carbon, extracted hydrocarbons for fuels, all these large programs that are hinged on the back of some pretty interesting food and food security supports, which include but are not limited to the creation of a global breadfruit market. So if you haven't learned about breadfruit, just go ahead and Google breadfruit and then start your deep dive into what could be a new superfood group, as well as something that leads us forward. Now, the common thinking right now is to take this wonderful plant that has had a relationship with indigenous people of the Pacific for 3,000 years, growing in a diverse food forest of so many other food groups, bananas, tree foods, coconuts, etc., the plantains, squashes, the root crops like potatoes, all growing very closely together in a tropical food forest. And now they want to take this tree, clone millions of them, and set up like they have in Myanmar and other Asian countries as well as Africa, huge orchards, monocropping this tree for the first time, which is, of course, as most botanists will tell you, going to open that particular tree up to new pathogens that always occur when we monocrop our food sources. So that's one piece of foolishness, to take a tree out of its natural relational growth pattern and put it into, a controllable machine harvestable industry. Yeah, and that's what we do as the culture of modernity, at great risk to the biology. So that is one of the lessons that we're working on in terms of how do we impact large systems, but you cannot impact the greater society or system by maintaining a relevant, actionable presence at only one area of the stratosphere. So where we live and where we come from, we need projects to be scalable, to be able to move from the 10-foot version to the 10,000-foot version to the 100,000-foot version of that same project, looking for the same actionable, explicit behavior that leads to the anticipated outcome. So what I mean by that is, whatever is true for our large regenerative community model, where we're setting up a large community farm that feeds its biomass to an energy recycling center and creates the fuels and the foods processing forward, including the stabilized carbon to reintroduce to the soil. That system and that way of educating has to be able to impact families, particularly young mothers and their children, in place. So too many times, grandiose plans developed by institutions that either never get off the drawing board, but is there a lot of money in the planning cycle? Never get off the drawing board, or when they do, are at such a scale that it's inachievable for community members and for people who live in those gap areas of our social economic development. And I, of course, am alluding yet again to single mothers and young mothers with children in community who always tend to get shortchanged. And that being the case, I want to demonstrate what I'm talking about. In the old model of distribution, the top 25% of this breadfruit crop would go to the commercial marketplace. The next 15% of the breadfruit would then be distributed in the local community, and the last 60% of breadfruit would actually become waste But in the new model, we want to use the top 15%, the highest end of the product for local community consumption. Give the commercial market, which is going to simply pulverize and dry and turn it into gluten-free flour, a mid portion of the 25%, not the cream of the crop. And then with our new programs, all the waste products are regenerated for use as hydrocarbon fuel and as carbon for reintroduction into the system. So we make out like bandits because we're now using 100% of our yield. So that being said, let's get to the meat of the presentation.
And I just wanted to show it to you because in the garden there are so many different kinds of plants, and they're all growing really close together in this 10 by 25 plot right outside the kitchen. And in a state of emergency, we would have food for about 4 days maybe right here. And so the papaya is growing next to the taro, which looks really beautiful. You can see down there. There's sweet potatoes all next to it. And there's oregano and mint, and they're all growing very densely, which is keeping out a lot of other weeds. And they're actually feeding each other, like this pigeon pea back here. This one is actually like a mulch plant. It also produces food and beans, but we break off the branches every so often and put a little pile underneath the papaya, and that feeds the papaya plant. This is probably in the next month, the new shoots will be coming up. I just wanted to reiterate that this is a 10 by 25 foot plot, and that every single family dwelling in Honolulu could have something just like this. This little section has a lot of endemic plants. There's the la'i, the ava, the hau back there. There's a little ohia tree that's waiting to go in the ground, and the uala and the olena right here in the corner. There's endemic ferns behind me. And if you look closely, you'll see that this looks like a forest floor. It might look like chaos to the untrained eye, but this is actually a collaboration between humans and what naturally occurs in the forest. Wow, has it really been a year since we've been at this garden? Look how much has grown. The pigeon pea has exploded in this space, and this is the la'i that I showed you last time. It's almost as tall as I am. The olena is doing really well here. Come around the side and see how this citrus tree that came up all on its own. We're going to be grafting that one with a variety of different citrus types. We have lemons and oranges on the same tree. Sweet potatoes are blooming. Should harvest some. They crawled out of the garden. And the collard greens, all of this understory is looking really nice and healthy. The collard greens here are creeping out of the forest and reaching for the sunlight. This oregano is looking a little bit big. I think it's time to take it back down to the ground. The spinach back there is really nice. And the banana tree, take a look at that. It was tiny when and now it's really rising to the occasion. This one, you remember this papaya tree was tiny. Look at it now. Beautiful papayas. And we're back at curry leaf tree that reminds me so much of my grandmother. We haven't added any fertilizers, a little bit of compost from around the yard, but this has pretty much been feeding itself for the last year. And you can see how well it's doing. Welcome back to the garden. You can see things have been growing everywhere. Here with us, everywhere. So we've added breadfruit. These are in pots. We're using it as a little nursery as the trees are getting ready to go in the ground. But we do have one that I'll show you in a bit that's in the ground here. Look how big the taro is. I think we're gonna pull this one soon. And the ava is really shooting up now that there's more space. Took the pigeon pea out. Things are evolving. Our old friend, definitely taller than me now. The Olohana, this looks like it almost is harvestable. And our altar, also providing minerals to the soil and a place where you can tell we are intentionally planting this garden. You can see these Olohana flowers. Look at that. Soon it will be ready for harvest. Our citrus tree with its pokey thorns just popping out of nowhere. This little patch is very new, a week old, of Ele taro. And you can see the different mulch layers. There's the coconut leaf on the top, keeping everything else down and moist. A new little hedge of pigeon peas that came up on its own. Ready for mulch plants. The banana tree is really shot up. And it has fruit. You see that? Also papayas on the big papaya tree, and young papaya trees are starting to come up as well. So as you can see, this is the same garden, but it's really changing over time, and that's the fourth dimension. It's like what's it going to look like in another 4 years? Hey everybody, we're back at the garden, and we're here to see what time has done to it. The fourth dimension. So the tall la'i, it's getting big. And back over here, my little Apu is with me. So there's one thing we hadn't mentioned before about this our altar here. When we built this altar, we built them with stones from the ocean with coral deposits on the surfaces, as you can see. And as the water travels over them, it washes all the minerals into the earth over time. So this is the high point of this 10 by 25 garden. And we're slowly adding the minerals back into the soil. He sometimes likes to help me mulch. He likes to break the tea leaves off and we put them under the plants. As you can see there, piles of the leaves, trying to keep all the moisture in here. It's been really dry. He loves the pigeon peas. Yeah. The breadfruit tree over here is taking off. And these papayas look amazing. Look, love. Should be nice, huh? We're here in the 10 by 25 foot garden again. Pooh and me. And we wanted to show you how overgrown it is, because we've been busy, of course, doing everything else. And we're going to be reinvigorating a lot of patches of this. So we want you along for the ride because, you know, life happens and sometimes your fruit forest becomes wild again, which is fine. That's one of the beauties of a food forest. It's just been growing and providing us with organic matter that we'll put back in now. So here we go. Take a look around. We're going to dig up the Olohana soon and powder it for our cooking and cut back all the pigeon peas. Some amaki. Yeah? What's over there? There's something. Look at all the pigeon peas we gotta cut. Pooh? Look! And what's back there? Come, Auntie Julie, come see. There's a banana flower up there. You see it?
So that was a program we had been working on. You notice the titling, Homegrown Food Forests. The idea being that there's really very little worth to these academic explorations if they don't actually turn into actionable steps that can be engaged in by the community. So you'll note that when we're talking about the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and, more importantly, the indigenizing of our yards, the reintroduction of the indigenous way of living that is void of a grass lawn with the ornamental shrubs, but rather replacing it with a traditional or native food forest that can offset the home economics. You were looking at a demonstration model of that 10 by 25 food forest, which every single family dwelling home in a subdivision or an urban setting would be possible to create this little emergency cache of food, but more importantly, create a canvas, a campus, as it were, where the knowledge can be handed down. I want you to note that that was over 7 years of recording that young student, Sarah, with the work she was doing with that 10 by 25 food forest. She introduced to a subdivision, a 1/4 acre single family dwelling, 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath house in Hawaii. You'll note that during that whole learning adventure, she had her child. You'll also note that the child was born and then was beginning to learn about the food forest. The next time we have an opportunity to interface, you're going to see that 3.5-year-old giving an interview about the gardens, about what they're doing. And that woman in the video is my daughter. And that's what we mean when we say the intergenerational transfer of the knowledge is probably more important than the knowledge systems themselves. The climate will change. The rain pattern will change. The wind will change. The available seed stock will change. The introduction of other regional plants will change. customs and behavior over time will change. What we need to focus on is that the mechanism of transferring the learning, the capacity for adaptation, and for actualizing the things that we need to survive, fresh water, energy, shelter, food and medicine, and education for the next generation, are of paramount importance. The framework, the ability of a peoples, regardless of their regional place, but a peoples of a regional place, to ensure their own health and safety, their own capacity, by granting them their naturally endowed sovereign rights to control their communities, their relational resources in a relational way, and move away from a transactional model that seems to suggest profit and loss at one person's expense for another's benefit. So we really need to re-regard the power of we over me versus individual achievement and advancement. I'm suggesting our systems of education, our ways of being in the largesse do not allow us to go there. So we have some challenges ahead of us. The good news is, hey, still a lot of room to explore the dynamics of how people do what it is they do as they're creating pathways for it. So thank you, and certainly want to get to some questions.
Thank you so much, Kalani. As always, you are so inspiring, and it's so great to see you today. So, any questions for Kalani? He should be able to hear you. If not, we have this mic. Use the mic. Okay, they're telling me. Anybody?
Be shy now.
I'll ask a question then. So here in our region with COVID, we had obviously issues with our food supply. And so for me, it was really interesting. As our tribe, we had USDA programs that stepped up and provided meal packages type of things, and you could go pick them up. And so I would ask, are you seeing that families and communities are, training people to go back to these traditional ways and solving some of these food supply issues?
Well, that's certainly true of where we live. I gotta mention a caveat, and that is we're 2,000 miles from the closest other land, and that's quite some distance, and surrounded by the ocean. So historically, we have been cut off from outside food sources in the past. In the past, however, we produced 75% of our food locally and imported some really specialty goods. Today, we import 94% of everything and only have 6% of the goods produced locally. And that 6% of the goods produced locally is generally in need of outside support in the way of chemicals or inputs. So only about 1 or 2% are being organically and locally sourced, locally grown. The population many years ago in Hawaii was about, after the plagues, dropped down to about 200,000. But presently, we're somewhere around 1.5 million, and 4 to 96% of the goods imported. This is a recipe for disaster. So for the last 10 years, we've been encouraging the community to source their food in local food gardens, community food gardens, as well as go from landscaping to foodscaping. We call it indigenizing your yard, using a little bit of indigenuity and indigeneity in getting out there and taking out those ornamental shrubs and putting them back into place. You know, my grandfather, he used to teach me the Hawaiian name for all these plants. And then there was another group of plants that he would just call pala or rubbish plants. So in his mind, if a plant couldn't be used as a food or as medicine or as a utility plant, like making ropes or basket, then it had only one name, rubbish. And it went over to the side and was used to feed the compost pile for the rest of the plants that had use. And so we get used to what we call foodscaping, working with plants that have a definitive use as opposed to landscaping. Now, the problem is also in our particular environment in Hawaii, success looks like the Hyatt Regency and the front lawn rolling up to the check-in desk. So people around here, when they want to appear successful, they tear out the food and they replace it with grass and like some cactuses. Not even edible cactuses. So anyway, that's just to give you an idea how regionally we each have problems. My recommendation is that all peoples in their region learn from the indigenous elders of a region. I want to caution that many of our tribal people have been relocated purposely by, the Department of the Interior, which used to be called the Department of War. When they relocate tribal peoples into new regions, I believe it's an overt attempt to separate us from the environments, the foods, the culture, and the practice that has sustained that particular group over time. So find an indigenous elder of the region you're in, someone with knowledge of the place and the plants and their changing methodology over time, and spend a lot of time at that radio tuning in. Listen as closely as you can. We have a saying in Polynesia, when an elder dies, a library is burned.
Anybody? I don't want to put somebody on the spot, but anybody else have a question for Kalani?
I got 3 questions for you, if you don't have questions for me. And these 3 questions were given to me by my grandfather. And they've always been the mark, the metric to which I measure my own performance, right? So that performance measurement looks a little something like this. The first question is, are the children fed? Are the children fed? Now, feeding children requires an awful lot of infrastructure. First of all, you're assuming that coupling is happening, right? And you can't be defensive and be feeding children. You need shelter. You got to be able to sit down. And if you've ever fed children, ever fed a small child, you know it takes all of your concentration. Because if you look away for even a second, somebody's got a spoon in their ear and there's a mess to clean up. So, feeding children requires an awful lot of support, not to mention the food. Oh, and by the way, children don't eat just food. So feeding and supporting children requires pretty much the effort of the entire village. There's a saying, it takes a child to raise a village. So the second question is, are the old people comfortable? Not getting by, are they comfortable? that means your society is a society that is aware of diminishing returns, understanding the need to support those who become less capable as they age, means your society has a surplus of capacity and goodwill. One other thing, recognizing the need to stay attuned with the elderly means you recognize the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Now, wisdom is a thing that can be learned, but it cannot be taught. So I want you to think about that when you're paying your tuition. Anyway, the third question is probably the most important. Are the women unafraid? My grandfather said, if you're sitting down at the dinner table and you look in your mother's eyes and your grandmother's eyes and your lover's eyes and your sister's eyes and your daughter's eyes, what do you see? If the women are afraid, what's going on with the men in your society? If the women are unafraid, they usually take care of the first two things. So these three metrics, these three ways of measuring in the form of these questions are what got left to me by my grandfather. And they have, in fact, over the last 50 some odd years, I'm now in my 60s, rapidly approaching 70, that they served me well over the decades. They're not perfect, but they remind me that it is not about the data sets. It's not about the public outcry. It is not about the political leanings. It's not about the popular movement in the popular moment. It's about consistently looking towards the future with the care of the children, consistently looking towards the past with the care of the elderly, and consistently looking towards the care of the present by ensuring that the women have their proper place in our societies. Now, I come from a matriarchal society, but my grandfather says it shouldn't be matriarchal or patriarchal. It shouldn't be any archal at all. What it should be, though, is matrilineal. Matrilineal. The science and the biology suggest that the mitochondria is handed down from grandmother to mother to daughter, and that the male is contributing one chromosome. One chromosome. So, let's really get back to attending if we want responsible education around the biology and the health of our people, then let's trace through the mother's line so we have a more definitive track of the genetic makeup of that particular human being. So I'm just saying science, nature, and the patterns we observe support the idea that the female is the base of the race group, and that males are a nice little added diversion. So I like being a diversion. I'm hoping to divert my wife as often as possible. And that being said, I want to again reiterate the strength of the community is in the relational values of the community, not the transactional values of the community. We really need to take our personal well-being less seriously and take the well-being of all into consideration. And by all, I don't mean just the two-legged sea monkeys. I'm talking about all of life has a right to fresh water. We should be questioning what Coca-Cola and Nestle's thinks they're doing. It's not just the people, it's all of life. And we're just some 30 hours off of the UN World Water Day. So let's all remember the sanctity of our resources, our relatives that make up the great Earth Mother, of which we are all part, in whom we all reside. And let's get geared up for Earth Day on April 22nd and get back to our families and our communities and do what we can to put food on the ground using traditional methodologies, using organic and natural systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kalani, for joining us today, and we'll let you go back, and you're doing great work.
It's early in the morning. I can still get surfing in and knock something out. Thank you so much.
Bye.